Hello, and welcome to the Argyle CISO Leadership Forum. My name is Eric Wallace with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. A couple of notes before we begin our discussion. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during the event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which includes complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. To ask questions during the session, simply type into the Q&A chat and we'll address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further delay, I'd like to begin our discussion. Let's begin with introductions, and we'll go counterclockwise on my screen. Carla, can you please introduce yourself to the group?
Yes, thank you. My name is Carla Wheeler, and I have over 15 years in technology. I'm a Chief Information Technology Officer. And anything else you want me to add there? I think we'll kind of go with questions.
I think that does very well. Nabil, can you introduce yourself? And then followed by Josh.
Sure, thank you. So my name is Nabil Shamsi. I work for Ford Motor Company, where I'm responsible for data security and privacy portfolio for our global data lakes and warehouses. Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm Josh Lundgren. I am a ex-developer turned marketer and developer evangelism leader. I work at an application security company called For All Secure.
Great, thank you. So let's begin with our first question, and that's, what do we mean when we talk about speed and resilience in the context of software security? Josh, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think speed, you look at how development teams are KPI'd in a lot of cases today, and it's always about how are you shipping? What are you releasing? Are you, accelerating your company's time to market? Are you pushing out new features that give you an advantage? And that gets broken down in a lot of different ways, something as granular as story points to something as, big as, are we getting a product in the market before our competitor? But a lot of times, and I think this is why that question comes up, there's then a trade-off. Hey, are you rushing things out that in a way that causes them to be less resilient, less reliable once they're up and running? And so I think it's really about, time to market versus the reliability of what gets pushed out.
Great, thank you. Carla, can we continue with you? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think with speed and resilience, the words that are underlined there is quality, right? And security. So when you think of the business or you think of the product team, they want things out as quickly as they can. And the developers will do just that. The aftermath is what hits the DevOps or the DevSecOps team, where they're scrambling, or the impact technology. So you have to package that within. And when you do that, sometimes there's going to be grumbling. So I think in order to have a proper end-to-end, you have to package that in. You have to package that in from the very beginning of your life cycle in order to have a proper, I'll just call it SDLC.
Great, thank you. Nabil, what do you think?
I agree. As soon as we start development, we should also think about what would be the launch and post-production support would look like. A lot of times those things are not prioritized in the interest of, we just gotta start development. And I see teams struggle at the end when they have not thought of the launch plan or thought of how they're gonna support it, or their users will communicate to them and report their issues. So that's a critical step and has to be thought through at each state of the development cycle.
Great, thank you. So how do you stay aware of software security risks, especially these risks that evolve so quickly? Nabil, can we start with you on that one, please?
Sure. In general, right, you do want to be aware of the security risk, and they are, as you said, they are evolving, right? So one place that's usually a go-to place is a CISA.gov. That's the U.S. government place. I know, so it's very heavy on the U.S. side, but it will have a good subscription of security risk and news. Additionally, you want to be subscribed to common vulnerabilities and exposure database. There are of those available. In addition to that, you want to do good security posture, right? You want to be aware of your asset inventory, your configuration inventories. That will allow you to know what is a high risk as these issues come in. So that's how I would start with.
Thank you. Carla, how do you stay abreast of software security risks, keeping up with them?
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. And then I would say, depending on your industry, so whether it's FINRA, your NIST, or whatever it might be, you have to stay on top of that as well. You use that as, I'll just say, your framework. And then the other part I want to say is just by networking, by staying in touch with just general things, just taking a moment, a few hours out of your day, seeing what's happening in the news, following up with your key learnings, looking at trends, taking your data and actually able to read your data. So if you're doing active monitoring and you're not just kind of taking that data and tossing over the fence, you should have an active monitoring team that's looking for that information. And if you're not doing yourself or your organization any justice, because I think we all know that we probably have some APTs in our environment, and it's just a matter of when it happens. And so we want to be as prepared as possible, because I don't think any of us on this call, whether we can see one another or not, want to be caught flat-footed.
Josh, what do you have to add on this?
No, I think that's spot on what Carla was saying, around you have to be doing something with the data that you have. I think in security, we have so much information coming in, and it can be very easy to lose the signal through the noise and say, hey, we've got all the data. So obviously we're aware, but a lot of times if you're not doing something, if you're not acting on that data, you're being averse. You're saying, hey, I'm burying my head in the grains of sand that represent the 1,000 data points I have, instead finding the 10 most important risks out of those and prioritizing with the business how you fix them. It's really about working with the business to understand the risks from the data you have and from the trends that are happening. If it's happening to someone else, it can happen to you too. How do you make sure you're aware of what that impact could be to your business? Because no two businesses are alike, even when we share common industries and common practices.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. So once you're aware of these risks, how do you prioritize them into high risk and low risk categories? Carla, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, so from a prioritization standpoint, hopefully you have some of your typical planning. What I mean by that is we've all done our tabletops, we have our DRs, we have our BCPs and our BIAs. So we already have an idea of what are priorities in place. So we've done that. And then once you have that and your new information, then you can start prioritizing. And then from there, it's just basically a method. And then when something new comes in, you kind of go through another reassessment. And it's just something you just kind of, as they say, rinse and repeat, and you just never stop.
Thank you. Nabil, can we continue with you, please? And then.
Yeah, so I'm going to say I agree, and I'm going to add a few things there. Carla, you gave a very good introduction. So yes, have a common understanding, develop a stakeholder or a governance board, right? Where you have your business partners and your IT partners together. Make sure that that board is meeting regularly on a periodic basis, right? As Carla said, the risks going to continue on evolving, and as new information comes on, something that you thought is a low risk, all of a sudden could become a high risk. So make sure that you have that periodic review along with your business partners. And one prerequisite to do that is you need a common place, a common viewpoint, a common dashboard, a common file, right? Depending on the sophistication of your business, you could use either a dashboard or Excel file or a proper GRC tool to allow you to have a holistic approach. So that's I'm gonna try to add. Thank you.
Josh, go ahead.
No. I think Carla and Nabil, I think you're both spot on. What I hear when I talk to a lot of security or development leaders is sometimes you run into these scenarios where you've got something with a high CVSS score. Okay, this has ostensibly very high risk, but it's only exploitable via a network connection, and it's running completely isolated from network. Well, that's actually not as high risk as it might indicate. And so making sure that the folks who understand the architecture, the folks who understand the business, and the folks who understand the security, data are all in the room together discussing and aligning, because otherwise you end up working in different directions. You're looking at fixing different things, and you're also not aligned on why you're fixing certain things over others. And so it's getting everyone together and taking all the data you have about your posture, the active threats, and what could happen if something was breached or exploited, putting that together to get that single view of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, here's what we need to address.
I just want to add on, I absolutely love that example, because I've seen people just take it because it's black and white. It just came from a tool. They don't really understand all the pieces, and they run with that, and they sound the alarm. They get everyone excited. And then once you drill down to it, it goes from a high risk to something that's not that big. And that's when it comes down to, unless you really understand it, you drill down to it, you make something out of nothing, or something small is just the opposite.
Exactly.
Thank you. This next question is related to prioritizing, and that's when you're making a trade-off between multiple priorities, how do you rank your priorities from lowest to highest? Nabil, let's start with you on that one.
Sorry, I muted myself. So yeah, so how do we risk priorities from low to high? I would say that you obviously need a common place to have all those associated risk listed. But second thing that you need is a common calculator or common method to calculate the risk and impact of the risk. So again, depending on the sophistication of your business, right? If it's a small shop, you may probably get by with an Excel file. If you are larger group, then you may need to have a more complex GRC tool to track these. But I would start with the impact being the most critical, right? And as Josh was pointing out, if the impact includes something that comes from CSV that is a higher risk, but you have mitigation in place, either through firewalls or other softwares or detective controls through monitoring, it may be of a lower risk. So that's how I would start.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Josh, let's continue with you, and then we'll conclude with Carla.
No, I think prioritizing between risks is, and again, it's one of those things that has to be collectively done, because everyone has different views on what's going to matter the most. But it's really, Nabil made the point, it's around impact to the business. And you have to align as an organization on what that is. And I think it's we've seen this trend over the past few years of more and more boards requiring CISOs to report out on, hey, what are your, plans if you get hacked, if there's a data breach, how are you responsibly disclosing this? There's starting to be talk of new regulations that require publicly traded companies to do that. And I think it's because there's a realization that ultimately risk boils down to impact to either the revenue of a business or lives that, are put at stake or impacted by, attacks. You think about a ransomware attack in a hospital, that can be a matter of, of people's lives. And so it's about how do we actually look at what has the biggest human and biggest financial impacts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Carla, let's conclude with you, please.
Yeah, I think that it's going to more or less be a repackage of what they both said, right? And I would just add that when you're prioritizing, it really comes down to, at this point, given that so many companies now have, I'll say, a larger digital footprint, it comes down to that true risk appetite, that digital, and then, of course, the obvious, the public embarrassment. So when you start kind of weighing those, that's where you just kind of have to surface it.
Great, thank you. So once you've got your risks identified and sorted into categories, how do you start mitigating those risks? Josh, let's start with you and then continue with Carla.
Yeah, I mean, I think mitigating, and a lot of times, especially when we talk about things like, application security, a lot of times folks think, oh, well, mitigation is fixing something. And it can actually, and Nabil brought this up earlier, it's not always about fixing an underlying vulnerability. It's about making sure that that vulnerability can't be exploited, or about putting defenses in place that make you more comfortable with the risk that it poses. And so part of it is, assessing, hey, for any given risk that we have, what are the potential mitigations? Is it something we can do with our architecture, network, environment? Can we put a firewall in place? Can we tighten up access controls? Or it's, okay, is there a code change we need to make? Do we need to swap vendors? Do we need to have our team, go fix some bugs, deploy some patches, create some new code? There's sort of a hierarchy of level of effort that kind of goes from a quick mitigation all the way to something more like a proper remediation. So there's, again, it's a collective decision on how do we both from a architecture, infrastructure, and a application side put the right pieces in place. And there's no one silver bullet that answers it. Each one of those things has to be triaged and treated separately.
Carla, what do you think?
Yeah, I guess I want to sidestep a little bit, and I want to kind of take a slightly layer deeper on the mitigation. So I think all collectively we talk about mitigation of risk, and that's fine. But what I've seen in many companies is that when we have to actually talk about it and we start bringing in architects, I find that a lot of times that our architecture teams, they're a little behind. And what I mean by that is when you ask for the documentation, it's old. And if they ever have to execute, they're scrambling. So when it's things that get down to a surface, you'll find that things are still very siloed. And that's very scary in many organizations. And with that being said, I think collectively, teams have to kind of slow down to get to that point. And I think we're all kind of flying by the seat of our pants. And we do tabletops, I say, up to a point. So as you were speaking, I was thinking, oh my gosh, if we ever had another kind of Log4j that I think we all kind of had some pain, we had that lovely Christmas gift. Thank goodness it was only a piece of stuff. But the point is, we were brushing off a lot of dust, just trying to figure out where we were. So I think the mitigation piece of that for all of us on this call here, I think we all need to go back and sharpen some pencils because we're all trying to move forward, but there's a lot of design work that still needs to kind of be rehashed.
Great. Nabil, let's wrap up our answer to this question with you, please.
Sure. So I'm going to add a couple of points there. And I think Josh and Carla both touch base on it. No risk can be isolatedly treated, right? So you need a layered defensive approach to begin with, right? You need to have your controls in layered fashion, whether it's a firewall, whether it's an antivirus software, whether it is a logging and monitoring, whether it is a good configuration list, so you know what configuration files you are using or you are receiving because somebody else has packaged the configuration for you and you were just receiving the software. So having that layered approach will allow you to quickly react to those situations when those emergencies will happen, because they will happen. So that's my addition.
Great, thank you. So our next question is, moving away from risk, how do you decide what trade-offs to make between speed and resilience in your software security? Carla, let's start with you and then continue with Josh.
Yeah, I would say deciding which trade-offs kind of takes all the information that we've kind of talked about between the business and the technology team, because one, they've done some of that prioritization. So you already kind of have an idea. And from that, you have your trade-offs as far as what is a true priority. So when you get into that, I don't want to say it's simple, but at least you have, I'll say you have a roadmap, and you should know what's your number one and what's your number two. And I'm not trying to simplify it, but you should. And if you don't, then what's going to happen is technology is going to make a decision and business is not going to be happy.
Thank you. Josh, what do you think?
I think I agree completely. It's having that alignment that allows you to say this is number one, this is number two. You have to do that. And ultimately, you know, it is still about risk. It's about what risks you are willing to accept as a business, what risks you are not willing to accept as a business, and where that balance really lies. I think, you know, touching a little bit briefly on the last question, you know, as well, and bring that into this, you know, Carla, you talked about, you know, really doing things by design. And I think part of the making effective trade-offs involves thinking about the full picture up front, because that's what gives you the ability to, you know, when you're doing something net new, deploying new infrastructure, moving, you know, migrating between clouds, you know, building and deploying new application. When you're doing something net new, thinking about how is this going to live in the world? What's it going to connect to? Where does it fit on my network? How do we access it? Doing that work up front and designing the security program at the same time that you're designing the application itself and the infrastructure gives you the ability to make better trade-offs. And to Carla's point, have that very clear 1, 2, 3 from the get-go versus trying to align on that while you're mid-flight.
Bill, what do you have to add on this question?
Yeah, so I think it was a great comments from both presenters. I would say the only addition I will say is having a regular governance board, right? Would be helpful. In a lot of places, these are L1, L2, and 3. A working level meeting, a leadership meeting, and then an executive meeting. And depending on as these issues are coming in, right, they can go up to for awareness and resolution. So that would be my only addition. I would say having a structure, predefine that structure as what's going to be your method when these things come in will save you a lot of chaos when these issues happen. So take the time now, establish it, and then you will receive benefits from it.
Great, thank you. And Nabil, let's have you lead off on this next question. How do you make the business case, or what trade-offs you think are sensible to make?
Yeah, so that's a great question, is how do we make, so I would start with the business value. I think it was Josh that was sharing that we got to start establishing if there is a reputation risk, if the risk is a financial risk, or if the risk is a loss of life, right? Obviously, loss of life being the highest, right? And then taking this on, right? Reputation and then loss of revenue, balancing those, making sure your governance board or stakeholder board that is reviewing these risks with the potential impact and or acceptance would be helpful. So having a common, again, going back to the common dashboard, having that single point of view for your executives, your leadership, who needs to review and make this decisions would be very helpful.
Let's continue with you and then conclude with Carla, please.
Yeah, I think Nabil is spot on with having that level of review. And ultimately, I think we can all look at companies that are in the news because of a breach. And it's very easy to say, well, what if? Or, oh, well, I can't believe that happened. And have a reaction like that. But the truth is, most companies have some level of risk prioritization that they're already doing. And the challenge is when you're breached, it's always going to look like you made trade-offs that maybe weren't right. And that's not the case. Breaches are going to happen. And it's about being confident in these are the types of risks that we're willing to take, even if there is some level of impact, because we know that we controlled higher level impact. We know that we prevented higher level impact. And I think that's a really important point that, especially, Carla, you mentioned this earlier, everything's digital, which means that there's a lot more, there's no perimeter. Like everything is everywhere. Bring your own device, work from anywhere. We've opened up how companies do business in a way that makes it pretty likely everyone's getting breached at some point somehow. And so it's really about how do you make sure that you're avoiding the worst possible consequences, and Nabil outlined kind of what those were, and being confident in your decision making that these are the business cases for prioritizing the risks we do, avoiding these things, and not worrying about some of the lower level ones as much when they happen. And it's not to say, hey, we should just ignore it, but it's about not letting that dissuade you from where you're pushing on those trade-offs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Carla, let's conclude our answer to this question with you, please.
Yeah, I would say just to kind of put a wrapper on that, and with the communication circle, I would just say training, education, and re-education, and just making that part of the circle, just keeping everyone informed.
Great, thank you. So is there any way to kind of move the throttle on both things at once and increase both speed and resilience in your software security practice? Josh, let's start with you and then continue with Carla.
I think there are two things that I hear when I talk to development leaders and security leaders alike the most. And the first is, to the point Carla made earlier, by design. If we're not aligning up front on what the scope of something is going to be so that security can understand how it needs to be protected, what things to worry about, what things to not, everyone gets slowed down. And so it's making sure that in the planning phase, all stakeholders are involved. That's piece one. The second thing I hear a lot from security and dev leaders alike is dev teams, when I was a DevOps leader like 12 years ago, I was shifting security scanning into my developers' world and saying, hey, now you are going to run this when you do a build and follow up on it. We're still asking them to do that, but now we've given them 6 different tools. And now they have 300 results on every, commit. What the developers feel is they feel burdened by the noise they get. And then because of that, development and security aren't always aligning on what do we go fix and what's the importance. I used the example earlier of like, hey, this is a ICVSS, but can't be deployed the way we deploy. Making sure that both teams are aware of that and can speak in a common language about that during build. Because if we're not finding a way to reduce the amount of noise and make security testing actionable for devs can't effectively help security prioritize based on the impact. And so finding a way to streamline that, I think, is super important for both sides, because otherwise then your DevOps teams, why does every build take, hours? Why does every build get blocked and sent back? Well, it's because dev and security can't fix it appropriately fast.
Carla, let's continue with you, please.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I'm speaking with another company today because there's a CIO and CISO that's having some issues because there's some vulnerabilities that are being tossed back and forth. And in today's world, there was a time that just basic QA was left to the side, right? We remember those days. And there was a time that security was kind of there. So now we have this thing called DevSecOps. So DevSecOps needs to be there and at the table. But then there's something else that's a little different. I would say maybe 10 years or so ago, there was this push and fight between a CIO and a CISO and who's first and who should report to whichever. I think that should kind of be readdressed now. Things are different now. And I think that's also kind of part of the problem. But to kind of address the question at hand, it has to be a full-fledged, adoption of DevSecOps, right? So DevSecOps, DevOps, and then we got to think of automation. We also have to think of automation of testing. You have security automation testing that's going to move things along. And then you have to have a really true agile methodology. A lot of people have things that smell like agile, not quite agile, but you have to have true agile. And if you can, have a real CI/CD pipeline. So if you have some of those things, that will help.
Great, thank you. Nabil, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm gonna agree. It needs to be every step of the journey, right? As Carla was saying, there used to be a QA environment. Now that is getting blurry. So the security testing needs to be part of the developers' tools that the developers are building as they are writing their code. They are able to utilize. I think Josh was touching base on making sure that developers are trained. So that requires a culture, and make sure that developer training is not just a checkbox, a yearly checkbox to say, okay, you go and we train you for 2 hours and you're good, right? They needs to be make sure that they understand what the ramifications are, and so they can take it to the heart. And then as Carla was saying, that let's make sure that the security DevOps are a combined practice. I think a good addition to that is going to be making sure that when the alerts are coming, somebody's monitoring and reacting proactively, right? Not 2 days later, not a week later. So they are aware of what's going on.
Right.
So that's what automation is the key, and is your friend here.
Great, let's switch gears a little bit and take some questions from the audience. Just as a reminder, audience members can still enter questions, and let's review some of the questions that have come through so far. The first question is, how does celebrating security successes affect resilience and culture? Nabil, can you take the first swing at that, please?
Yeah, so that's a tough question, right? Because this sounds like a opposite of it. Right? Security succeeds when something doesn't happen. So it's very hard to celebrate the culture. Hey, we didn't get breached today. So from that perspective, having good KPIs, right, and establishing those KPIs, measuring those, are going to be very helpful to make sure your security team is is measurable. Their successes are measurable. Plus, you can defend it when the times are tough, in cuts, in matter of budgets, right? So from that perspective, establishing KPIs, making sure everybody understand those KPIs, and then measuring regularly, right, against those are going to be your celebration points here.
Mm-hmm.
Josh, what do you make of this one?
I think security is in such a hard spot, because to Nabil's point, like, it's about things not happening. And a lot of times security gets attention only when something goes wrong, only when you're in the news because of a breach. And it's both about having those KPIs. I think also part of it is security teams do a lot of work that isn't just reactive. There's a lot of proactive, security engineering to build out new defenses, to work on things that iteratively improve your mitigations, improve your layers of defense, improve your processes, make things faster, and make security more streamlined within the business. So security is not slowing different parts of the business down. It's actually helping enable. And I think one thing that security teams have to be able to do is communicate that work and celebrate that work across the organization, because that shines a light on the day in and day out of security that isn't just, I think a lot of times people think about like a old school SOC, an analyst sitting in front of a monitor watching alerts come in. Oh, let me go look at this. Oh, let me go look at that. And the reality is a lot of teams have moved away from that model into more of a proactive, how do we continually build upon our defenses approach, and recognizing that work, celebrating that work, I think helps the organization as a whole understand that security is not just about react to threats. Security is about build the defenses for the next year, for the next decade.
Right.
Thank you. Carla, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the offense and defense is absolutely key, with the KPIs, not letting them get stale. And if you have proper, I'll say, vulnerability scanning there, that's an opportunity to definitely celebrate, because there's so many things that the security teams that they see and they keep quiet because they've addressed it. And I think if that goes on your metrics, on your dashboard, and they see all the things that they've taken care of that didn't turn into something big, and they see all the effort that these team members are putting out there, that's worth celebration. I mean, these team members are just doing a ton of work.
Yeah, I agree. I'm gonna add just one more comment there. One thing I've seen successfully implemented in few places is a security champion or security ambassador, which are embedded in these skill teams or groups, and these people are responsible for coordinating and celebrating the success between the core security SOC team versus the developer teams and business teams. They also can help educate each other, right, on the business risks and what's going on. Or at times I've seen a champion come in and say, hey, my area is doing this. Is this a good idea? Right? And all of a sudden you found out that you prevented a breach, because what they could have done is expose a personal data in an application or in a product. Right now, as the products are IoT connected, they are carrying certain privacy and security risk along with them. So that'd be my addition.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, how do you remove security silo department and incorporate it into software development? Carla, can you lead us off on this question, please?
Sure. I mean, part of it is getting the buy-in to have, as we were talking about earlier, having a true DevSecOps. And when I say DevSecOps, I'll explain how I had it in an organization. I'll just kind of paint it that way. So in an organization, there was a DevOps group, and just imagine that you had your application engineers. And so just as we were just talking about, what we did was we made sure that these individuals were treated as engineers, right? They weren't just ticket takers. They weren't just SOC members, right? Because sometimes they're minimized as just that. When they're embedded as quality engineers, talented individuals, right, they're at the table with everyone else. The other thing that we did was we made sure that we took engineers and we pulled them into the fold, and we made them accountable for the development and the code that they were putting out. And we actually trained them into some of the security piece. And I'll say we gave them some privileged security, so that they can also train some of their engineers. So as we brought those security folks into the fold, they became horizontal into the pipeline, into the fold of our pipeline. So once you have that buy-in, they're part of that software SDLC from end to end. And that's also part of the smoothness of it. So hopefully that answered the question, and I'll turn it over to the team.
Bill, let's continue with you, please.
Sorry, is that Josh or me? Sorry.
Let's start with Nabil and continue with Josh, please.
Okay, sorry, I misunderstood. So thank you. So silo departments and incorporating into software development. I think Carla gave a very good example, right? Having a integrated team. I would say one thing I've seen also is establishing a COE, right? Community of practice. That allows, again, people to branch into the development teams, and for the technical questions when your developers are seeing, hey, is this really a security scanning risk that I saw? How do I mitigate it? These teams can be helpful. So establishing a community of practice, whether it is volunteer-based through security champions, ideally you do want to have technical developers who are part of the COE, who can teach your developers, understand the risk, and teach your developers how to mitigate those, are going to be helpful. Again, all right, depending on your business size of your business, one size does not fit all. So you got to be cautious as how much structure you're developing in order to maintain it.
Yeah, I didn't call out that community, but that's part of that. That's the combination of the engineer with the security as well as the DevOps. That has to be part of the cycle. That way you don't have the inner fighting.
Yeah. Well, if you don't have that community, the accountability that you're talking about doesn't exist, because the community can keep itself accountable versus it being someone's to-do or KPI on a checklist, but they're in a silo, and it, again, it's not a visible KPI. The
Yeah.
community is so vital.
Exactly.
I think about, security, and I think we've seen a bit of a convergence between security and reliability as everything's gone digital. Like, those are very hand in hand. Availability of services, reliability of services, security of services, it's all part of one larger practice now. And I think bringing more of that in, and I think part of it is treating security as just part of your platform infrastructure, just part of what's in your backlog, what the team's focused on. It helps to normalize the fact that, hey, and development teams are used to this. You've seen the rise of like the site reliability engineer role, where this is the developer who is the expert in how these systems are deployed and running and kept reliable. That's the security champion too. That's this is the expert in how these systems are secured, that they then work with the rest of the team to make sure that's actually happening. That pattern exists. And I think it's about how do we make sure that teams are empowered to do that and make sure those roles are there and building the communities around it. Yeah.
I agree.
So our next question is, can you please give some examples of low risk to go live with software development? Curious to know what the low risks are. Josh, can we start with you on that one, please?
Man, I'd kind of go back to the example earlier of just, hey, something that looks critical, but the way you're deployed, you've actually got, 3 mitigations before anyone could ever exploit it. Those are the types of things that I think tend to be low risk. And again, that's one example. There may be other things where, hey, okay, if someone did exploit this service, they can't go anywhere. There's no critical information. There's no impact to the service performance, reliability, availability, customers, revenue. It could be something like that as well. And again, this is part of the challenge, because one of those looks very severe, but isn't based on how you're deployed. One of them looks really small and is based on how you're deployed, but for, the next team over, that second one could leave your entire, network exposed. And so there's no, this is always a low risk. It's about the intersection between the exploitability, the reachability, the mitigations, and what happens after the breach, what the spread and impact can be.
Great, thank you. Nabil, let's continue with you, please, and then conclude with Carla.
Thank you. So I'm going to agree. I'm going to add a little bit, as it also depends on your environment. If something is internal usage only, right, and it's going to be only exposed to your internal vetted users, which is going to be through VPN or on your network, maybe it's a lower risk because the chances of somebody installing a malware or doing a SQL injection are lower. If it's something is, as Joshua was saying, right, if there is no network control and is externally exposed, or if it's a product or a device that people will have, then even a low risk is harder to quantify unless it's a cosmetic error, I'm going to say. If you are off the internet and you're a product that people are using on their health devices, even a low risk would be a greater risk in maybe not be today, but maybe tomorrow. So treat it accordingly. It depends on the use of the product.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The only thing that I would add to that, or I would throw into that the puzzle is IAM, right? So really kind of considering the access management, who has it, reassessment of that. And then you kind of talked about the devices, and even though we're all over the place, DLP is key, because as we're all over that data slips out, and with IoT, that's something we really need to consider. I think we get a little loose with that from time to time.
True. Very true.
Great. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you all for that really insightful discussion. I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand after the event is over. Thanks very much.